that said, I want to introduce today's speaker. Carrie Shanafelt is an assistant professor of humanities at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she teaches on philosophy, literature, and film. She gets to do all the fun stuff, basically. Her current book manuscript, The Utility of Pleasure, you see what I said about the fun stuff? Considers the centrality of non-reproductive sexuality to the work of Jeremy Bentham. We're going to hear about Jeremy Bentham in a second. An article from this research will appear in the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation next year. This month, an essay on Vladimir Nabokov and language theory will appear in the volume Samuel Johnson Among the Modernists. She's also published essays on pornography and the Gothic novel in Literature Interpretation Theory and the College English Association Forum. So I'd like to, ask you all to join me. Today she's going to speak on the trouble with Bentham, a couple other things to say. This lecture is co-sponsored. We're very happy to have it co-sponsored by the Africana Studies program and the program in Women's and Gender Studies, and I'd like to ask everyone to thank those programs and help me to welcome Carrie Shanafelt.
So this lecture is actually sort of a response to what people say when I tell them I'm working about Bentham. They say, oh, Panopticon, right? Which is a minor project from his early career that I wanted to avoid the whole time I was thinking about his work. The other thing that people say is, have you seen his head? Which is separated from the mummified body that is often on display at University College London. They had to remove the head because the mummification process was not very good looking and it smells really bad. I am told, I sent one of my students, if you can get your students to look at Jeremy Bentham's head for you, that's always a good move. Okay. Like most people who read philosophy, I skipped Jeremy Bentham on my way through. What was the point? His best ideas had been re-articulated, I had been told, by the evidently saner John Stuart Mill. And his worst ideas suggested a disturbing desire to quantify human happiness and reduce it to measurable units. What he called his philosophic calculus was a proposed calculation based on the principle that, and this is the first quotation on your sheet, I should basically have one of those probably too, okay. It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. This greatest happiness principle has largely been the butt of jokes and a topic for universal derision since its articulation. Political science students and graduate students in philosophy may waste a few days inventing calculations for how many units of pleasure should be assigned to a conversation with a friend, or asking whether a sadist's pleasure in harming someone could outweigh the pain of being harmed. Sure. We can imagine all kinds of trolley problems, right? How many people are going to die versus how many people are going to live, that sort of thing. Whose happiness makes the most number, right? My initial dismissal of Bentham was strengthened when, as an undergrad, I read Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times in a political science course. Rather than engaging with any texts by Bentham, we read this popular 1854 novel in which Bentham is the inspiration for the inhumane hyper-rationalism that devastated the English working class by indoctrinating poor women, especially, to willingly abandon desire, imagination, and aspiration for the good of society as a whole. Dickens uses Bentham as the prototype for his evil teacher, Mr. Thomas Gradgrind, whom he describes thusly: with a rule and a pair of scales and the multiplication table always in his pocket, sir, ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature and tell you exactly what it comes to. It is a mere question of figures, of simple arithmetic. Mr. Gradgrind uses that human arithmetic to prove to his working class students that they are meaningless cogs in a much larger and more important machine in which their joylessness is mathematically irrelevant. Is there no depravity that we can't justify using Bentham's philosophic calculus? Later, in a Victorian literature course, instead of reading Hard Times, we read Michel Foucault's 1975 work, Discipline and Punish, in which Bentham once again was the primary villain. Bentham had advocated the introduction of various systems of discipline that promised to increase efficiency, lower costs to the state, and decrease the suffering of prisoners, the poor, and children. Foucault uses Bentham's Panopticon, which was a drawing of a prison that was never built to his specifications, as a metaphor for modern systems of surveillance and control. The Panopticon, as Bentham proposed it, would replace the older kind of prison exemplified by Newgate. Newgate was a dungeon in which prisoners, most of them sentenced to death, were chained to a wall over an open sewer, where they then fell victim to brutal violence, disease, and suicidal despair. Bentham's proposal for the Panopticon suggested that many of these prisoners could be reformed and reintroduced into society if they were offered private, clean quarters, exercise, and encouragement not to return to crime. He proposed that a tower could be set up such that the prisoners don't know whether there's a guard in the tower or not, and that the possibility of surveillance would become, as Bentham called it in his proposals, a machine to grind rogues honest. Foucault asks us to consider how modern life, with its constant surveillance, our blood-ripe lives squeezed into data and efficiencies, optimizing our own bodies for productivity, has simply replaced oppression by the state with oppression of ourselves by ourselves. If the Panopticon replaces Newgate as the dominant model of social control, then we're all always in a kind of prison for our whole lives. Most recently, Vivasvan Soni's powerful book, Mourning Happiness, published in 2010, identifies Jeremy Bentham as the philosopher who effectively killed happiness by reducing it to a mere product of physical pleasure. Soni convincingly argues that the classical secular definition of happiness as the result of a satisfying life devoted to moral excellence was eroded in 18th century literary and philosophical discourse by sentimentalism, by political theory, and by literature, which culminated in Bentham's reduction of happiness to a quantification of sensory pleasure. As Soni writes, at the moment that the word happiness is captured by pleasure, we lose an important way of relating to the narratives of our lives. This will always risk sounding like asceticism, but it is our only chance for a concept that will be able to sustain a politics of happiness. In Soni's account, the liberationist potential of happiness as a political end lies in its dependence on a personal narrative of moral fulfillment. And to empty happiness of its moral content is to render it politically powerless. While much of the idle mockery of Bentham by people who've never read him might be waved off, these charges against Bentham by Dickens, Foucault, and Soni are serious. They reflect much of our modern despair and our sense that we've had our lives stolen from us by quantification, even as we strive to realize our ambitions for education, work, and family. Just last week, our current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, claimed that actually larger class sizes are ultimately better for primary school students because it frees up so much funding to reward the most excellent teachers, suggesting that those rewards could be determined on the basis of quantified learning outcomes measured by standardized test scores and mechanisms for disciplinary surveillance. All of us who work in 21st century universities are familiar with these kinds of claims about efficiency, discipline, surveillance, progress, optimization, austerity, and the bottom line. When we consider how Bentham's philosophic calculus has been used by capitalists and fascists to obfuscate the spiritual essence of humanity behind clouds of easily manipulated data, it's easy to turn away from him, glad to be ignorant of the impulses that drive a mind capable of such monstrousness. 5 years ago, however, everything changed for me. In 2014, The Guardian published a review by historian Faramers Daboiwala of a new volume containing a series of notes Jeremy Bentham had written during the 1810s on the topic of what he was then calling sexual irregularity. Far from the image I had in my mind of Bentham as an inhumane calculator, I found this work devastating in its compassion, rage, and desire for egalitarian social justice. In one of these essays, for example, Bentham compares homosexual intercourse to abortion and to the uprising of enslaved people, noting that all three are described by politically enfranchised European patriarchs as unnatural behaviors, only because they can offer no evidence that they're harmful in any real way to society. Like abortion and political rebellion, same-sex intimacy is apparently worth risking death for. Bentham argues that all three must be seen as forms of resistance to intolerable social servitude, in which the majority of the people have been forced to relinquish custodianship of their own flesh to those who would use them for their own purposes. In Bentham's philosophic calculus, the numbers should obviously fall out on the other side. The white patriarchal men would be forced by data, if not by compassion, to realize that women, laborers, colonized and enslaved persons, and sexual and gender minorities far outnumber them, and that the happiness of society depended on the recognition of each of those persons as a full citizen whose political, social, and economic enfranchisement was and is an emergency. It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. I think that takes up a new force for me when I think about it in that light. That is, we can't trust this tiny minority of self-interested property-owning men who control the government, the economy, the church, and philosophical discourse to tell everyone else what's allowed and what's a crime. I've spent 5 years since then reading everything by Bentham that I can, the works he published in his own lifetime, as well as those published since his death. Last summer, I went to University College London to read boxes and boxes of his private notes, drawings, plans, and diaries from the first years after he left off studying the law until his death. Across the course of this reading, I have come to believe that Bentham's career can be roughly divided into two parts. There was the 18th century optimist and the 19th century pessimist. During his optimistic years, Bentham believed that he could promote the amelioration of suffering through schemes to demonstrate the benefit of liberation for patriarchal oppressors. If only he could convince them through reason that it was in their self-interest to do so, they would change the laws, divest from colonialism, promote women's education, suffrage, and bodily autonomy, and decriminalize consensual non-reproductive sexual intercourse. Bentham developed his theory of philosophic calculus during this early optimistic ameliorationist period. Having qualified for the bar in 1769, Bentham found himself unwilling to pursue a career in the law since, as he reasoned, a bigoted or corrupt defender of the works of power becomes guilty in a manner of the abuses which he supports. As an expositor of British law, he could only become accessory to oppression. As a reformer, however, he would tirelessly advocate for revisions of the penal code, for example, writing extensive treatises on the poor laws. As they stood, the poor laws made it nearly impossible for laborers and people in debt to get on their feet. Bentham notes that the new government licensure of midwives, for example, made it effectively illegal for women who had expertly served impoverished communities all their lives to practice their trade. In every realm of society, the people who needed the most help were the least able to get it. As the laws created more and more incentives to see the poor as a drag on the economy rather than a source of valuable labor and expertise if they could be kept healthy, even the political backbone of the nation. Likewise, it's during this period that Bentham believed he could successfully argue that the government ought to protect victims of homophobic mob violence by repealing the Buggery Act 1533 and instead instituting a law to punish its would-be vigilantes. The bigotry of the penal code was that it criminalized everyone who was already politically and socially disenfranchised. The case of male same-sex intimacy seemed to Bentham the most obvious testing ground for the law to correct itself. If the violators were otherwise fully enfranchised men with access to rights, then surely legislators could be convinced to extend the liberty of bodily pleasure to them. And if he could be successful in this argument, he could also convince legislators that physical liberty must be extended also to the poor, to laborers, to colonized persons, and to women. The Buggery Act 1533 was also obviously a really bad law. It's poorly written. I don't know if you've read it, but it basically says like vague things that should not be done between men or between men and animals, and then it sort of backs off, right? It doesn't describe even what the crime is, but don't do it. It's also an unenforceable gesture on the part of Henry VIII to recategorize ecclesiastical jurisdiction as a function of government. That is, the Catholic Church had handled sexual matters in their own way, but as Henry was coalescing church powers for himself, one of those powers was the punishment of sexual deviance. This power was almost entirely symbolic. The state had no business in the bedroom unless it wanted to exploit the law to eliminate political enemies by accusing them of sodomy. In its first 150 years, the Buggery Act was invoked only a handful of times in high-profile cases that typically also involved political intrigue. But by the end of the 17th century, the rise of popular homophobia in England had given new venom and force to the law. Over the following century, sexual and gender nonconformity became one of the most urgent priorities of legal and extra-legal violence. In order to create victims for a literally victimless crime, agents provocateurs were hired to seduce suspected homosexual men and inform on them. And tavern owners began reporting customers to magistrates if they saw them touching in ways they suspected to be more than friendly. Even the extreme severity of the penal code did not satisfy the desire for revenge against sexual nonconformists. In the church, in secular literature, in the theater, and in the lynch mob, the sexual nonconformist of the late 18th century would find nearly universal humiliation and violence, ranging from mockery to death. That this vast orchestra of violence was arranged just to prevent a private act of consensual mutual pleasure suggested to Bentham that sexual nonconformity was an important testing ground for modern political theories of liberty. As early as 1773, at the age of 25, Bentham began to speculate about the special case of sexual nonconformity, the violent rage with which moralists address the subject, and the potentially disastrous effect this rage has on the entire penal code. In one set of notes, after listing various moralists who've declared consensual same-sex intercourse to be worse than murder, worse than raping your own mother, Bentham scribbles in the margin of his notes, this is on your handout, I do think there are other methods of displaying virtue than preening forth their fury against a vice of which they're secure from the temptation. To Bentham, if no corruption is possible because the acts are performed in private between or among consenting parties, and from which no unwanted offspring could be the result, sexual enjoyment should be considered one of the most beneficial and harmless activities imaginable for the general happiness of the people. That one person might prefer same-sex partners rather than heterosexual intercourse was a matter as immutable and morally insignificant as preferring a particular flavor or smell, and he often uses this comparison. One of my favorites is he says, you can force someone to stop smoking, but you can't force them to stop liking the taste of tobacco. It's such an interesting and lively comparison. However, since despite the rise of secularism, the spread of education, the increasing inclusiveness of the press, and the movement toward libertarian rights discourse, violence against sexual nonconformity seemed to grow with each year. Bentham suspected that the problem was normativity itself, that legislators had confused aesthetic disgust for penal imperative. He wrote, this is on your thing, vain man that makest thyself the standard of everything, that can't suffer or bear with no passions but are what are thy passions, that makest even a merit of feeling nothing like indulgence for a fellow creature who neither injures thee nor anyone. Say, are there not miseries enough already upon this earth without thy heedless cruelty adding to the heap? The biggest obstacle to the liberation of disenfranchised people was that patriarchal European men simply had no compassion for people whose pleasures or conditions of life were different from their own. Legislators couldn't imagine craving a same-sex intimacy any more than they could imagine being a woman impregnated through coercion, a laborer whose livelihood has been criminalized, or a person kidnapped and enslaved thousands of miles from home. The solution to the bigotry of the law was clearly the full political enfranchisement of marginalized persons who could represent themselves to government. Bentham watched to his dismay as the so-called revolutionary era produced all this soaring rhetoric about equality and rights while perpetuating an exclusively patriarchal ruling class who owned human beings, profited from colonialism, abetted genocide of indigenous peoples, exploited laborers, controlled women's bodies, limited their minds, and persecuted anyone whose sexual pleasure did not contribute to population growth. Bentham wrote a series of open letters and pamphlets to the governments of Great Britain, the new United States, Spain, and revolutionary France, demanding that each of these nations live up to the promise of their political rhetoric and grant all of their citizens bodily autonomy at least. The most famous of these letters, and you can find it easily online if you're interested, it was later known as "Emancipate Your Colonies" with an exclamation point, because there's a lot of exclamation points in it. It was first addressed to the National Convention of France in 1793 on the eve of the Reign of Terror. In this powerful document, he challenged French legislators to recognize that in holding on to colonial territories, the new republic had made lies of their own declarations of human rights. He wrote, "To give freedom at the expense of others is but conquest in disguise. To rise superior to conquerors, the sacrifice must be your own." Proceeding through arguments appealing to justice, economics, global diplomacy, and utility, he mocks the imagined protestations of French revolutionaries, satirizing their colonial reenactment of the same tyranny they had so recently overthrown. This is on your sheet. "Think of how you have dealt by them. One common Bastille enclosed them and you. You knock down the jailer, let yourselves out, you keep them in and put yourselves in his place. You destroy the criminal and you reap the profit. I mean, what always seems to you the profit of the crime." By treating so many far-flung colonial subjects as too subhuman for human rights, France had, as he describes it, declared war against its own body, turning healthy limbs into cancerous excrescences that must ultimately attack in self-defense. Bentham attempts to reason with the Republic that French territory must only include citizens it can and will treat equally under the law, or else they would have begun a cycle of perpetual political violence as each disenfranchised group comes to claim their so-called human rights. I was thinking that, about the protests in Paris over this past year, that this is a kind of cycle of, okay, no, now we're coming for our rights. No, we're coming for our rights. In this early optimistic phase of Bentham's career, he believed that the suffering of the populace could be ameliorated by convincing legislators that it was in their own financial and political interest to expand liberty for oppressed people. He warned patriarchal oppressors that the time would come when all these groups would join together, rise up, and seize power with violence if necessary. Bentham assured to these governments that if they expand protections for liberty and security to all citizens, the result could only be economic and political stability. The most controversial project Bentham embarked on during this time was his plan for the Panopticon prison, which was an attempt to convince the British government to invest in the health and reform of convicted felons rather than leaving them in a dungeon to die of disease or violence while waiting for the hangman. He knew that the abhorrence of criminals ran so deep that in order to advocate for their survival, he had to develop a way to make their survival profitable. The Panopticon would consist of individual cells arrayed around a central tower wherein a guard might or might not sit. Bentham proposed that he himself would be the first jailer and he would take no pay at all. He was always volunteering himself for things. Additionally, he imagined a device that would allow prisoners to get as much exercise as they wish in their cells while helping to turn a water mill, thus earning their keep through their labor and offsetting the cost of building and maintaining the prison. During Bentham's lifetime, the Panopticon was never built, and he complained bitterly about the project's failure after the resignation in 1801 of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, who had entertained Bentham's correspondence. It had been a proposal in which all boats should rise, prisoners would be healthier and more capable of returning to society, and the government would spend less on prisons and executions. This disappointment contributed to the more cynical second phase of Bentham's philosophy, in which he began to realize that the suffering of oppressed people was not just an unfortunate side effect of limited resources, it was the entire motivation for having resources to begin with. Long after Bentham's death, the Panopticon has become a metaphorical and even architectural model for every kind of institution. Prisons, factories, public spaces, offices, schools, and shopping malls all replicate this appearance of privacy with the fear of invisible surveillance. Is there a camera in here? Oh, there. To encourage each individual subject to contribute to maximum productivity, repressing their own will for the sake of the purported collective good. What Bentham failed to predict in the first half of his career was the limitless sadism of powerful men. He believed that if they could be convinced to invest in general happiness with the temptation of greater economic benefit, they would. Instead, he found that they only wanted to employ his schemes for economic benefit while maintaining the dehumanizing fear and demoralizing sorrow they extracted from those they exploit. Creating pain was the goal, not a side effect. Throughout his earlier writings, Bentham constantly laments his rhetorical failure, having failed to convince anyone with political power to extend even harmless liberties. After the failure of the Panopticon project, he began to develop a theory of sinister interest, which is the name he gave to unaccountable, excessive sadism in powerful men. His former skepticism about particular institutions like law, religion, or philosophical discourse began to bleed into one another as he saw that what they all had in common was a unified desire to humiliate, marginalize, and persecute anyone who might demand custodianship of their own body. While claiming to promote the happiness and liberty of all people, these institutions have quietly perpetuated pre-modern patriarchal conceptions of social order, in which the bulk of the populace lives in self-denial and privation so that the power of the landowning class can be maintained without challenge. In an 1822 note to a new edition of An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham recalls having heard that in 1776, Alexander Wedderburn, then Solicitor General, had expressed fear that the greatest happiness principle of utilitarianism was dangerous. 46 years after Wedderburn's original comment, Bentham publicly identifies the motivation for this fear not in his own lack of rhetorical clarity or skill, which he had often lamented, but in the sinister interest that a man of power and wealth like Wedderburn has in holding the bulk of the populace in a state of misery and disenfranchisement. In the last part of his career, Bentham began to recognize that his detractors only pretend not to understand his argument. Rather, they're terrified of being ruling over people who could become the rightful custodians of their bodily pleasure and political power. On January 3rd, 1818, in a haunting series of numbered notes titled Pleasures of the Bed, and I've put this, I found this in one of the boxes at University College London, and I started crying, and I was like, you can't cry on this document. Bentham speculated on the urge to use religion and philosophy as justifications for inciting violence against non-reproductive sexual pleasure. He concluded that legislators have restricted the physical pleasure of sexual intercourse to reproduction, while prohibiting sexual liberty in order to render the populace joyless, guilty, lonely, and miserable, hopeless enough to be silenced in their demands for political and economic enfranchisement. This is 39. Pleasures, life valueless, being without well-being, pain remaining, its value to be negative. Philosophic pride and religious terror have joined in the endeavor to deprive men of all pleasure of which mind is not the seat. Yet, take away impressions, you take away ideas. Take away sensation, you take away understanding. Take away pleasures of the body, you take away those of the mind. With all this before them, men have waged unceasing war against bodily pleasure, wholesale and retail. Maximizing life and minimizing pleasure being the object of there's a blank space. He must keep up life as a receptacle for pain and allow pleasures of the bed adequate for the production of the maximum of those who for the purpose of this pain should possess life. That blank space in the manuscript, I think it comes at this moment where Bentham is feeling like, that guy, the man, right? Whoever it is who's demanding this pain, right? He goes there, right? Near the end of his life and hopeless of success and reform, Bentham instead theorized that power feeds on human misery, on the joyless people who don't even have the liberty to end their own lives, and who are damned to satisfy themselves with exclusively reproductive sex, only so that the pain may be perpetuated in the next generation. Bentham developed his theory of sinister interest in the 1810s alongside his most complete and explicit arguments about sexual persecution, which he came to link with slavery, colonialism, and the oppression of women. Victims of these forms of political violence were expected to recognize, to already know, that the sublime language of rights was never intended for them. Without custodianship of their own bodies, or even the Lockean natural right to protect themselves from harm, these groups became, Bentham suggests, a receptacle for pain, with neither the right to take their lives nor the power to overthrow those who celebrate their misery. So how did things go so terribly wrong for Bentham's legacy? How did someone who devoted every moment of his efforts to the liberation of oppressed persons become a laughable oddity at best, and the evil genius of dehumanizing modernity at worst? For the remainder of this talk, I'd like to speculate about 6 possible reasons for Bentham's failure, moving from his own limitations as a writer and philosopher to the more sinister interests of those who pretend not to understand him. 1. Like most really transformative philosophical thinkers, Bentham is a terrible writer. As my own Enlightenment philosophy professor, Blandford Parker, used to say, someone who is reinventing or dismantling the metaphysical basis of epistemology or ontology has to practically invent a new language to express that. Bentham struggled throughout his life to express himself in a way that readers could understand. He is tedious, long-winded, and frustrated by potential misreadings, even while his pen is moving across the page. You can kind of see that. He kind of re-edits himself all the time. In some of his notes, he longs for a writing partner who could move his readers to feel the truth of his prose, in the way that he himself enjoyed Gothic novels by women and sexually nonconformist authors. He suggests William Beckford as like, ooh, he could write my work with me, Gothic novelist. In his published writing, he can be dull, contemptuous of the reader's stupidity and vanity, and extremely defensive. It isn't until one reads his private papers addressed to himself, or perhaps to future sympathetic readers, and many of these papers have been suppressed, mislabeled, all of that kind of stuff, so they're actually kind of hard to move through. That makes one feel the urgency of Bentham's liberationist desires. Thanks to the Bentham Project at University College London, these private papers are almost entirely publicly available for free on the internet. You can look them up, Bentham Project, they're all online. They've been scanned in beautiful copies, you can blow them up. And for those who haven't yet learned to decipher his handwriting, which is a trial, they have been largely transcribed by a global phalanx of volunteer readers. None of us are radical enough for Bentham, I'll warn you, but we are perhaps the less hostile readers he imagined could one day find him. 2, Bentham was extremely fearful of being silenced or maybe even killed for his ideas. As bold as much of his published writing was, he also published a great deal under pseudonyms, including his excellent daring works on theology, an analysis of the influence of natural religion on the temporal happiness of mankind, terrible title, great book, and Not Paul but Jesus, great title, less good book. But for every major published work, Bentham had reams of drafts in which he clarified what he really intended to say but felt he couldn't, because of the intellectual asceticism of his time, especially regarding sex and suicide. While Not Paul but Jesus focuses on what Bentham saw as Paul's misreadings of Christ's theology, the notes for Not Paul but Jesus contain what can only be called a queer reading of Jesus's life, as Bentham thought, as a gay suicide who came to teach children, laborers, and women how to live like free people. Of his writings on sexual nonconformity, Bentham wrote, 100 times I have trembled at the thoughts of the indignation that must be raised against the apologist of a crime that has been looked on by many and those excellent men as the blackest under heaven. In many of these notes, Bentham directly addresses some reader not yet born who will live in a time when his ideas are no longer criminal. 3, Amelioration does not stave off violent revolution, it hastens it. When I referred to the optimistic earlier phase of his career, that was also when he developed ameliorationist ideas. Just like in the history of Atlantic slavery, amelioration of any intolerable condition only makes it more intolerable. If you read the history of slavery in the 17th century and 18th century, you see this, that any time and place where slavery was made less violent, that was where uprisings actually happened, right? Because those people had the bodily integrity and sense of community and enfranchisement to have the community needed to rebel. Brick and Carrie has argued that the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 was developed to stop well-meaning Quaker slaveholders from allowing enslaved people to form families, enjoy culture, avoid violence, and so forth. Even if healthier, happier conditions prolonged enslaved people's lives and increased their economic productivity, it also always made revolution more likely. One of the things that I think young Bentham may not have understood about prison reform, poor law reform, and the education of women is that their oppressors knew if these groups weren't totally dehumanized and demoralized, they would demand seats in parliament with torches if necessary. The happier people are, the harder it is to oppress them. Foucault, this is point 4, is, of course, to some degree right. Modern forms of surveillance, optimization, and discipline have resulted in a culture in which most people gladly oppress themselves so the state doesn't even have to do the work of making us unhappy. We do that all by ourselves. I kept thinking of Boots Riley's film Sorry to Bother You from last year, in which the impoverished laborers happily sell themselves into slavery to a company called Worry Free, because at least they'll know they have a bed and food. They don't have to worry about a job. What Bentham seems to have unwittingly invented in the Panopticon is a scheme for deriving increased productivity from laborers without allowing them to feel as if they actually own their bodies and pleasures. Bentham imagined a scenario in which all boats could rise. Patriarchal oppressors figured out how to use that information to raise their own boats while turning the rage of the oppressed against one another. Number 5, Vivasvan Soni's charge that Bentham reduces happiness to mere physical pleasure is one that may rankle the sensibilities of the philosophically minded. Just because the opportunities for morally reflective happiness are unequally distributed shouldn't perhaps mean that they're politically useless, but that they should be expanded to all demographic groups, right? I have no argument with the democratization of moral purpose, except that, as Bentham argues, the oppressed are always expected to prioritize moral purpose over physical gratification. Privileged people are rarely more disgusted than when they see their social inferior enjoying a flavor or a feeling that either doesn't appeal to them or of which they might be envious. Bentham accuses lawmakers of deriving the penal code from aesthetic disgust for other people's pleasures rather than from any measurable social noxiousness. The great irony of hegemony is, of course, that the people at the bottom must learn to desire higher things, while the people at the top gnash their teeth for decadence in the sewer. Bentham's neo-empiricist deontology, which I didn't have time to discuss much here, attempts to divorce human action from the euphemistic and dysphemistic moral language that is applied differently to people of different social condition. And he talks about things like drinking, right? If you're a rich guy and you like to drink, you're a party guy, you're lots of fun, right? But if you are a poor person and you like to drink, you're an addict and you have to go, you have to be stopped or put in the drunk tank or whatever. Who gets to feel physical pleasure without stigma? Why, those who also control the discourse about law and resources. Until that stigma is removed, one must begin, Bentham argues, with liberation of the body. 6. On some level, though, we must accept that the most dismissive criticisms of Bentham, reducing him to a babbling calculator or a sadistic, flinty-eyed jailer, come from people who have largely inherited the hegemonic legacy of white supremacy, inherited wealth, political enfranchisement, and relatively little public humiliation for their sexual and private pleasures. While Bentham was the rare white, wealthy, educated man who imagined all human beings as craving bodily autonomy and political representation, those whose lived experience has been homophobia, racism, sexism, imprisonment, and poverty still only rarely find themselves in a position of engaging critically with Enlightenment-era philosophy. Bentham's published and private papers open a door that many historians of Enlightenment culture would prefer to remain shut. If it was possible for a 25-year-old white man in 1773 to imagine a world in which women, laborers, and sexual nonconformists have access to legal redress for infringements of their autonomy, how could our current political realities have emerged differently if people then or now had ears to hear him? Thank you.
So for those of you who don't know, the way this goes is you ask questions, I run around with this thing and sort of leave it near you so that it gets on the recording, and then Carrie answers, and we do this. So I'm just going to run around a lot. So who's got questions?
I have very basic
Okay.
because it's not my area.
Yeah.
I saw some philosophical discourses into Bentham in early virtue exercises. But not all books, right? So because
that
really
early on,
also
right,
early consequential utilitarian.
And yet,
So
he wanted.
do you have any knowledge about?
I mean, I think he gets used for consequentialism later, but he himself kind of rejected that consequentialist proposal because he wanted to say that it is, in this very local context, good to promote liberty to choose your own pleasure, right? Which I think the problem with virtue ethics is that the moment you introduce the concept of virtue, then you introduce a concept of that your pleasures are a product of moral reflection. Bentham actually thought that pleasure was a part of sensation. He even wanted to recategorize sexual enjoyment as a sixth sense, so that it's not like you enjoy what you enjoy because you thought about it and you thought it was the right thing to do, and you know, but because you just enjoy it the way that you enjoy a smell, right? That he felt that pleasure was so immediate that it wasn't a matter of reflection at all. So any kind of social structure that can maximize access to pleasure at that kind of just bodily level was the only thing that the state could do to make people happier. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like he gets used by people who want to turn him into a virtue ethicist, but that he himself kind of rejected that sense that that you can link that kind of goodness to moral feeling.
So you think he might be opposite?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, if right and wrong is simply the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and happiness is pleasure, and pleasure, he says, is utility, right? He wanted to use that Humean language of utility by saying that pleasure is usefulness. It makes you more energetic and able to live your life.
Okay, thank you.
This is sort of a follow-up question. I'm just very sort of fascinated and confused about like the moralizing elements and the sort of the trying to sort of get the morality out of it, right? Because he's sort of doing both at the same time, right? So there's a story about sort of pleasure where it's sort of just like a sensation thing, right? It's sort of morally neutral. You just sort of have it, right? On the other hand, and I can see what's sort of motivating that. On the other hand, there's all these people that take pleasure in the miseries of the poor, and he's outraged by that, right? So he's clearly moralizing about that, where that's the way that's their pleasure. It's like a sensation for them too, right? So I'm just curious, is there a way that all coherently fits together, do you think, with him, or is he sort of divided in some way, or?
He has a chart, you won't be surprised to learn, called the Table of the Springs of Action, which is a really cool thing, where he basically talks about every human motivation and how close to the body it is versus how far away from the body it is. There's the desire to eat, the desire to have sex, the desire to sleep, the desire to work, the desire to be famous, all of these kind of things, and they have kind of fanciful names like the the pleasure of the trumpet and the pleasure of the scepter and that, all of these things. The pleasure of the pillow is just like people who like to nap. I like that one. And then under it, he draws up a table of the euphemistic and dysphemistic language for each, right? That is, Hume says that the way that we know whether something is useful to society is whether we use positive words to talk about that behavior or negative words. So Bentham actually takes that pretty seriously, and he starts writing out all the positive words that you could use for somebody who likes to eat a lot, right? And then he writes out all the dysphemistic words, all the nasty words that you use for a drunkard and somebody who is too excessive. And then he basically starts sorting out, well, when do we assign each of these things to whom, right? Do women ever get assigned the euphemistic language for a particular, desire or behavior, right? So I think he was always wrestling with, he wasn't ever really good at writing, I think, a clear explanation of, I don't think that he thought things like sadistic pleasure at the abstract concept of the suffering of the poor was an immediate bodily sensation, right? The way that sexual pleasure or drinking a beer is, yeah. But the table of the springs of action kind of is kind of a fun, everything about Bentham is a little fun, way for him to kind of organize with himself, how do we deal with things like sadism or the desire for power, or these abstract feelings that we can't tie to a physical sensation.
So I'm not sure how pertinent the question is. First of all, I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I do have a question, when you go to Foucault and Bentham and the different perspective they have on this prison environment. And one of the things I think about is how different is this prison monitoring from what the small tribal village is doing, and that this is in some way taking over for the fact that the society is so large that it can no longer control all the behaviors. I don't know if I'm
no, that's a
making
wonderful
clear
argument.
my question.
Yeah, absolutely, and it makes me think about one of the despairs of the 18th century is that for example, the economy has gotten so large that we can't have moral feelings about where our clothes come from or our food, right? Swift says in Gulliver's Travels, this world must be gone 3 times round before one of our better females can get her breakfast or a cup to put it in, right? So when we think about that sense of being kind of divorced from an economics of presence, right, where we can say, okay, I know the person who milked the goat that gives me this cheese, right? That those are social relations in which people could police each other. I think that's absolutely right? Bentham doesn't see it as kind of the institution of some kind of new system of frightening impersonal control, although I do think he introduces it that way to the people who he wants to fund it, because he knows that that's what they want. They want a scary thing, right? But I think that he wants some kind of, how do we think in a humane way about a criminal, right? How do we think in a humane way about somebody who is incarcerated? Yeah, I love that idea. I want to pursue that.
So, you talked about kind of, I guess, what nowadays you call it kind of neoliberal-esque, at least, regimes of kind of measurement and kind of mathematization of certain social objectives. And I'm wondering, to what extent, in Bentham's time, there is nothing even close to statistics. Math is only just beginning to be starting in computations as compared to starting with ancient Greek geometry. The use of variables for anything is reserved for elites who know differential calculus. So this is beyond even just rich people know how to use variables. This is mathematicians know how to use variables and no one else has heard of the things. So I'm wondering, it seems like you couldn't possibly be committed to these kinds of things because there isn't a mathematical or scientific, a social science way of talking about measurement and comparison this way.
There definitely was a lot of bookkeeping, and it's in the late 18th century that you see kind of the rise of everything can be kept as the books, right? In fact, I would even go back to there's a great passage in the novel Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Dwight Coder gave a talk about this that I really loved, where he was talking about. There's a character who's mentioned who tries to quantify the value of every blade of grass on his estate, and he goes mad, and he's like, how much will I get out of each cow per year, and how can I increase that and stuff, and that's from 1749. So there was that kind of we could quantify everything to the point of absolute madness, and I think that we can see it in Olata Equiano, who's writing in, was that 1792? I don't want to get that wrong, where he talks about learning to keep books is kind of how he is able to buy himself. He buys his own freedom by kind of not cooking the books, but working the books a little bit to kind of extract excess value out of each trade so that he can eventually collect enough to buy himself. So I think there were a lot of people who were thinking about at least bookkeeping level datafication as and efficiency models and that kind of stuff as the way that you game the system, right? How do you get out of the current system of the way things are? Well, you find those little shreds of excess value and you collect them and you get them into the same place at the same time. So nothing like the kind of complicated models that you're talking about that rule our lives now, but the beginning of those models, I think we see them in the 18th century.
So, because I know Foucault weirds this, but for Bentham, because before an hour ago I literally knew nothing about him except the head thing. For Bentham, what is incarceration supposed to do to pleasure? What's the relationship there supposed to be?
I think Bentham hated incarceration in part because he didn't trust the penal code. The penal code itself was so unjust and so evil that anything you could do to ameliorate the condition of all prisoners is a net good, right? What he got after finishing studying law under William Blackstone, who I think is as enlightened of a legal theorist as you could possibly have in the 18th century, Bentham came away from that experience so disheartened because he realized there was absolutely no just way to participate in the legal system. And he refused to sit for the bar. He refused to go on to be a judge or a lawyer. And he felt that participation in the legal system as a practicer of law would make him guilty of putting people in prison. Howard's State of Prisons, I think that was published in 1780, was a kind of expose using images. He actually had woodcuts made of copper plates engraved with these incredibly detailed pictures that were renderings of conditions in Newgate, conditions in Bridewells, and stuff like that. So I've seen it. It's like a beautiful folio volume that's hand-colored and stuff, and it was meant to be a visceral experience. Once you see the state of prisons, you're like, oh, something has to happen about the state of these prisons, right? So I think it was kind of in the air and on people's minds that there was something really broken in the prison system. There were also people who were really advocating for the change in what happens to debtors, because debtors would then be thrown in prison, and Bentham participated in that dialogue.
So does Bentham see any positive utility in suffering as well as pleasure, or is it just pleasure for him?
Yeah, he's just into pleasure. Yeah, it almost sounds a little like he doesn't, I think what he fears is that he sees that women and poor people and laborers are told that their suffering is somehow virtuous. And he thinks that's like the sickest joke ever perpetuated on human beings, right? That the mortification of the flesh or whatever form that takes is a really disturbing aspect of the ways that we've perverted what he believed to be Christ's message. I didn't believe it either. In his private notes for Not Paul But Jesus, he does this reading of the life of Christ that is so moving and so interesting, and I think wrong. I just taught the book of John in my Bible class this week, and I was like, you know what? It is a shame that Bentham was not right about Jesus, but he says, in his account of Jesus, he says Jesus eats, he likes smells, he likes pleasure, he likes intimacy. Like Jesus never says no to a meal. Jesus never says no to a drink. Like Jesus never says, never is ascetic. And that word asceticism was a kind of, that was the theme of all of Bentham's later work, was that the real crime was that we force people to deny themselves access to their desires. Why? Because if you don't own your own body, then you don't even know what you want, right? Locke says early in the first treatise that men must own their wills and pleasures, right? You have to own your own pleasure to be able to be a political subject. And I think Bentham takes that really seriously.
So just following up on your question. So it sounds as if, again, I don't know that much about Bentham. This was a real eye-opener. It sounds as if his focus in terms of prisons is on re-education or retraining as opposed to retribution or revenge. Am I reading that right from what you said? And is he presenting a new way of thinking of the criminal?
He doesn't do much about re-education. That comes later, I think. That's kind of, brought to the situation later. He's really worried just about survival. The conditions in Newgate were, seriously, there were like rats coming up out of the sewer that people would be, chained in front of and unable to get away from. Animals biting them, in addition to other prisoners attacking them, and of course, spreads of disease and people stealing food. People, and people, if they did emerge from Newgate and were often transported to America, they were deeply, deeply dehumanized by that experience.
So then, what would be the purpose of removing them from society? Is it just to isolate them from society as opposed to retraining, or what is the focus now or the purpose of a prison?
The purpose of the Panopticon was to be cheap, to be a cheap way to keep prisoners alive, and to put them in a situation where they could at least survive long enough for the question of their reintroduction of society into society to be possible. People in Newgate often didn't survive even long enough to be executed. So when we're talking about the Panopticon, part of what bothers me about the Panopticon papers is that the language of them is kind of like, yeah, we're gonna really show those criminals who's boss, and grind rogues honest, that kind of language that I find so offensive and un-Bentham-like. That was because he's writing to William Pitt the Younger and trying to create a public, foment public support for this project. And to say, and it's not gonna cost you a penny, right? I will be the jailer, right? And they'll make energy by running on their treadmills or whatever. That kind of language that Bentham uses is his attempt at being rhetorically convincing to people he knew hated prisoners and criminals.
What did later socialist or Marxist theorists make of Bentham? Did they take anything from him?
Well, okay, so part of the problem is that he left his papers with John Bowring, who went through them and basically mislabeled, hid, got rid of. It's very obvious that a lot of his most radical work, and I cannot underestimate the amount of stuff that he wrote about homosexuality. It is impossible to tell you that every single line of Bentham also has apparently like a series of notes about what it had to do with homosexuality behind it, right? He was always thinking about homosexuality, even though, as far as we know, Bentham was not homosexual. There's no evidence of him having same-sex partners, but this was just such an obvious example of something that needed to be considered when we think about political liberty. And yet, those papers were kind of kept separate. It's box 74. I think some of this stuff I gave you is from box 74. And that was a box that to this day is mislabeled in very strange ways. The cover on some of the folders in there says it's about, a simple plan for a blah, 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 nothing about homosexuality. A lot of these papers have been hidden. They're also almost illegible. The Bentham Project has all of these people around the world who are transcribing Bentham so that you can read these things. They are available. And also, Clarendon is continually putting out actual volumes of some of these notes. The one that came out in 2014 is called Of Sexual Irregularities, and it's just a slim little volume, but it's just mind-blowing. Article came out in Critical Inquiry last week from Frances Ferguson, just responding to that volume, thinking about how that volume kind of changed her mind and made her rethink Kant and all this stuff. So that material is kind of only now coming out and available for scholarly use. I mean, of course, scholars have been able to get to University College London and learn to read it, but even just finding that material has been difficult before now.
So I actually just wanted a follow-up question on some of the prison stuff, because it was surprising what you said. So is the idea that if Bentham could have his own way, like he becomes philosopher king or something, there's no prisons. He's basically an abolitionist. He sees no positive value for prisons. But because of the situations he's in, he thinks the best thing he can do, the next best thing is to have prisons that have less suffering, and that's all he really cares about.
I don't think that Bentham ever really conceived himself as a philosopher king, right? I don't think he ever did that fantasizing that a lot of philosophers do. Almost every other philosopher is sort of like, if I had a country, it would be run like this. Bentham, I have never found anything in Bentham that says, if I could have a country, this is how the penal code would be enforced or anything like that. What it seems like instead is that he is trying to optimize the current system. He admits, for example, that obviously there should be laws against theft. Why? Because it decreases pleasure, right? Your pleasure is taken away if somebody tries to steal your stuff, right? But he says that's not why they pass laws against theft. They pass laws against theft because, I have this great passage, I didn't include it here. He imagines a legislator just kind of sitting around thinking, I have a feeling, I hate theft, I have this feeling in my heart. And he kind of does all these noises and stuff in the manuscript about, it's very funny. I have a state to govern. I look about me. I see what is happening. I see an act. I dislike that act. What should I do? He says the laws begin in the breast of the legislator. It does not begin in an objective understanding of the world. Laws don't begin because we see injustice and injustice is outside of us and it's real. It's because we have an aesthetic disgust for things that we don't like. And so some of those things like theft don't work according to Bentham's system and should probably be punished somehow. But I haven't found where he says that he has some solution to how to punish theft. Other than how can we optimize the current system?
Did Bentham ever consider or address homosexuality between women?
Oh yeah, a lot. The papers on sexual irregularity are very, very, very specific about sex acts. Lots and lots and lots of kinds of sex acts. He was very interested in thinking through the ethics of things like bestiality and necrophilia and all this stuff, which he thought was fine. They're dead. When I said that he's too radical for you, I wasn't lying, right? He thought you should cut your arm off if you want, like it's your arm, right? But when it came to lesbian sexuality, by the time he's writing, there was a period earlier in the century when I would say lesbian sexuality was something that was very frightening, that people were writing, pamphlets about it. You have to watch out for lesbianism. Later on, Bentham felt that women's sexuality had become kind of sort of tolerated because it wasn't politicized, because there wasn't kind of a
any women in parliament, you couldn't arrest anybody who a political opponent.
Right. But men were being arrested, just regular men in taverns were being arrested because, a barmaid thought she saw, some hanky-panky, right? But women were often alone together, sleeping in the same beds in all kinds of situations where nobody really suspected and nobody really asked. And at one point in one of these papers, he says, if only we could treat male homosexuality the way that we currently treat female homosexuality, that it would just be your own business, right? That it wouldn't be considered a public act at all. It doesn't have a public import because it doesn't affect other people. He doesn't then go on and say, oh, then there should be gay marriage or something like that. He's not imagining a kind of political state in which homosexual relationships are politically equal to heterosexual relationships, but lifelong unmarried man, he wasn't thinking about marriage a lot.
So, you mentioned that he didn't care particularly for imagining gay marriage, but the institution of marriage in the 1700s, it wouldn't be a position you would it was pretty much defined by a certain sense of patriarchal relations so it's not something that even you would want to be included in because it was kind of inherently dominating a certain way that was probably
absolutely. And I have wondered if that was why I read some of his love letters from his 20s. He has some kind of really sad correspondences with he knew that the woman he was seeing may have seen him speaking to someone that she didn't like, and so he wanted to explain things to her. He wasn't super, he didn't have a lot of game, is that what? He's very neurotic and he's kind of spelling everything out. But I have also wondered if partially, his not desiring a marriage has something to do with his fear about kind of the patriarchal politics of it. Sure.
Oh, sure. I sort of have a million questions, but the one that I think I'm going to ask is sort of, I think, and this is partly in response to Gianna's question, so he's not worried about if we could treat it with this kind of benign neglect, for lack of a better word, that, we treat, women's relationships. So this raises the question of norms. You mentioned norms sort of early in the beginning, and I sort of wonder, right, so he's not, he has this kind of evaluative standard at one point that he's trying to use. And he has actually a pretty complex evaluative system, trying to figure out how to, maximize or idealize sort of relations, which, I think has an interesting relationship to the modalities of thinking of capital, of the sort of nascent sort of social powers that are kind of, social powers that are really in increasingly sophisticated ways, explicitly kind of driving things in his society. He understands this, he recognizes this. He clearly is also sophisticated enough to know how to talk to people who are operating in those terms and make things appealing to them, which might be what gets him in trouble later. But you suggested that he's not interested in being a normative thinker, nevertheless. So I guess I want to know, how do we square that kind of non-normativity with, and even this kind of push for various kind of liberationism with some of that other stuff?
Right. the non-normative part is about aesthetics. Okay. So that's specifically what in the original stuff that I was writing about Bentham and trying to get people to care about was I kept saying sexuality in Bentham is recategorizing morals as aesthetics, right? This thing that had been thought of as a moral problem. Oh, you are an immoral person, that's why you want to have same-sex intercourse, right? He says, no, it's just an aesthetic preference, right? It's just an aesthetic preference, and also it's an aesthetic preference, right? He means both of those things, right? He means pleasure is important, right? But the difference of pleasure, de gustibus non est disputanum, right? Like that he says that we cannot tell somebody who to enjoy having sex with any more than we can tell somebody what flavor they want in their mouth. Right? That is the kind of private pleasure that he's kind of talking about in terms of non-normative aesthetics. But in terms of society, he wants to create a norm that we all mind our own damn business, right? Which is about aesthetics, right? Which he thinks is everything, right? So as much as possible, we have to say, if it doesn't affect me, right, then what you enjoy is what you enjoy. And if we could create a social norm like that, it would be something.
All right, so I'm going to follow up just a tiny bit. I mean, so what then becomes, what this suggests to me that's sort of, I think, really interesting is he's also then going to reject, something which had been a significant 18th century project, right, which is the idea that aesthetics should be subject to some kind of standard. Right.
That's, I think, where he messed up. But he didn't understand that other people think of aesthetics as a kind of judgment rather than a kind of pleasure.
Right. And I guess just to sort of to take that one step further, I mean, it becomes interesting, I think, in the rejection of that notion of a standard of aesthetics, sort of, it's tied to a kind of, it's tying to a kind of liberationism, right? I mean, this is okay.
I mean, we were talking about this in your, I loved finding this one paper that Bentham wrote in which he imagines a new kind of theater, a new kind of drama. And he's a young man and he's writing this kind of obsessive little treatise on what if there was a new kind of play, and it's a kind of play that goes on for like hours and hours and hours, and you have to get up and have a meal, and maybe there's dancing, and then you go back and you sit down and you watch more of the play. And as he's writing all this out, and you're like, what are you talking about? Is this some kind of like Erich von Stroheim film or something? Like, he decided that it would be really cool to watch a play of his favorite female Gothic novelists who had written these really, really long books with hundreds of characters. He's like, I want to see it all on stage, right? I want to see it all performed, right? I don't just want the sort of play that's, it all takes place in a day and has 3 characters in it, right? He wanted to see this massive spectacle that would take hours and hours, if not days. And one of the things that I love about that treatise is at the end he kind of writes in the names of these women novelists that he really loves, and they're not like people who at the time would have been read as high art in any way. Like Gothic novels were the most sort of just like devour, I mean like mass market horror fiction, right? Like you just pick them up and eat them up. So I think that in a certain sense, like Bentham had kind of non-normative aesthetics for a man of his class. Yeah. And I think that also, we always say this if you teach literature classes, that there is something about reading the perspectives of somebody who's not like you, right? And I don't want to overstate that, but because I think that young literature students like me, when I was a student, I was like, I'm a better person because I read all these books, and that's not true. But I do think that politically there is value in reading perspectives that are unlike yours, right? Reading poetry from a mind that's experienced a feeling that you have not had before, right? You take on something, some little bit of that perspective. And I think Bentham may have gotten a lot of his sympathy for oppressed people through reading.
So on that note, we're actually over time.
Oh, okay.
And I'd like to I'd like to thank, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Professor Shanafelt for an absolutely fascinating talk and a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. And, well,
I thank you.